In the middle of the 19th century, the world stood at the edge of discovery. The year was 1845, and the spirit of exploration was pulsing through Europe like blood in a vein. Science had become the new religion of progress. Inventions, industrial revolutions, and the mapping of distant lands gave the impression that humankind was on the verge of conquering every corner of the earth. In Britain especially, there was a confidence that nothing was beyond reach. The Empire's ships crisscrossed oceans. Its explorers charted rivers in Africa and mountains in Asia, and its scientists cataloged everything from exotic plants to newly unearthed fossils. To the Victorian mind, nature was no longer a mystery to revere, it was a puzzle to solve. And yet, in the summer of 1845, an event would begin that defied this optimism. An expedition that would end in silence and shadows, challenging the very belief that science could explain all things. The driving ambition of the time was the Northwest Passage. For centuries, explorers had dreamed of a maritime shortcut through the Arctic, a frozen highway that would link the Atlantic to the Pacific and transform global trade. Many had tried, and many had failed. Ice swallowed ships whole, and men froze, or starved before they could return. But each failure only sharpened the hunger of the Empire. By the 1840s, the British Admiralty believed the time had come to succeed where others had faltered. They had the resources, the technology, and the men. What they needed was a leader. That leader was Sir John Franklin, a veteran of previous expeditions. Franklin was respected, though some whispered that age and misfortune had dulled his edge. He had once been nicknamed the man who ate his boots, a reference to a desperate earlier journey in which starvation forced his men to boil and eat the leather from their footwear. But in the eyes of the Admiralty, Franklin embodied the grit and resolve of a British officer. At nearly 60, he was not young, but he was steady, devout, and unyielding. If anyone could tame the Arctic's cruelty, many believed it was him. Expedition he commanded was fitted with the very best of Victorian ingenuity. 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were chosen for the journey. They were no ordinary vessels. Both had served in polar regions before, reinforced with iron plating to withstand the crushing ice. They were retrofitted with the latest technology, including steam engines adapted from locomotives, which allowed the ships to travel under power when winds failed. Inside, there were heating systems to keep the men warm, something earlier explorers had only dreamed of. The Admiralty spared no expense. Providing canned food supplies meant to last for years, along with scientific instruments to record data and chart the unexplored. To Victorian eyes, these ships represented not just exploration, but science itself, rational, prepared, invincible. The crews were carefully selected, numbering 129 men in total. These were sailors hardened by experience, many of them veterans of previous Arctic voyages. They were promised adventure, honor, and a chance to etch their names into history. The mood, as the expedition prepared to depart, was one of confidence and pride. Families gathered to see them off, waving and cheering as the ships slipped into the waters, bound for glory. The newspapers of the day praised Franklin's mission as certain to succeed. After all, how could such well-equipped ships and skilled men possibly fail? Yet beneath the optimism was the shadow of the Arctic itself. The northern ice had defeated some of the greatest seafarers in history. Even the might of Britain had not yet bent the polar regions to its will. The frozen seas were unpredictable, shifting with the seasons, crushing wooden hulls like matchsticks, trapping crews in a white wilderness where no rescue could reach. Indigenous Inuit people who had lived in these lands for generations spoke of the harsh spirits of the ice, of the unforgiving power of the cold. But to Victorian ears, such stories were dismissed as superstition, relics of a pre-scientific world. The age of reason had no room for legends. If the Arctic posed mysteries, science would solve them. Or so it was believed. When Franklin's ships sailed out in May of 1845, they carried not only provisions and men, but also the weight of expectation. This was not merely another voyage of exploration. It was a statement of dominance, a proof that knowledge and technology had no limits. It was believed that within a few years, news would return of their triumph, and Britain would claim mastery over one of the last uncharted regions of the globe. But as weeks turned into months, and months into years, no such news arrived. Arctic had swallowed the Erebus, the Terror, and every man aboard into silence. Families waited in anguish for word that never came. The Admiralty grew uneasy, then alarmed. Search expeditions were dispatched, each returning with fragments of confusion, abandoned camps, cryptic notes, whispered stories from Inuit witnesses of men starving on the ice. But no clear explanation. Science, with all its instruments and reasoning, failed to provide answers. The mystery of what happened in 1845 only deepened, leaving a nation obsessed and haunted. And so, from the moment Franklin's ships left port, what began as a tale of confidence and progress would unravel into one of the greatest enigmas of the century. The Arctic had presented a question that science could not answer. The summer of 1845 carried with it the weight of expectation. Yet the deeper the ships pressed into the Arctic waters, the more that optimism seemed to fade into an uneasy silence. For a time, there was still hope. The first leg of Franklin's journey appeared uneventful. The Erebus and Terror were sighted by a whaling vessel in Baffin Bay, their black hulls moving steadily through the icy waters. The crews of the whaler spoke with Franklin's men, exchanged friendly words, and then watched as the expedition vanished into the white horizon. That was the last confirmed sighting of the ships by Europeans. What followed was silence. Months passed, and no word returned. By winter, families still clung to hope that Franklin was wintering safely in the ice, as many Arctic explorers had done before. But as the months turned into years, that silence began to feel less like patience and more like dread. What truly happened to those men in the first months after disappearing into the frozen maze of channels has been pieced together only through fragments, both physical and spoken. The ice of the Canadian Arctic is a shifting labyrinth where channels close overnight, trapping ships in walls of pressure that creak and groan like a living beast. It is here that the Erebus and Terror became ensnared. The ships, designed to withstand extreme conditions, held firm against the crushing ice, but they were immobile, locked in place, their sails useless, their men stranded. The Arctic had claimed them, and the only way forward was through survival. Crews attempted to adapt. Franklin's men were disciplined. Daily routines of cleaning, maintaining the ships, and recording observations were followed with military precision. The heating systems were engaged, and the supplies those precious. Cans of preserved meat and vegetables were opened. But it was not long before strange problems emerged. The tinned food, which had been hailed as a technological triumph of the time, was poorly sealed. Many of the cans were soldered with lead, contaminating their contents. Over time, lead seeped into the food, slowly poisoning the men who depended on it. They would not have known why they felt ill. Headaches, stomach pains, confusion, and weakness spread like an invisible plague among the crew. The very supplies meant to protect them were, in truth, killing them. Meanwhile, the cold gnawed at them without mercy. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, and the endless darkness of Arctic winter fell. Men who ventured outside the ships faced frostbite, their breath freezing into crystals on their beards. The ships themselves groaned as the ice pressed harder, creaking like dying leviathans. For those trapped inside, time stretched unbearably. Imagine the soundless blackness of a polar night lasting months, broken only by the wind shrieking across the ice and the moans of the sick. Discipline gave way to despair. Franklin himself, the man entrusted with the expedition's success, did not live to see its end. Sometime in 1847, just 2 years after setting out, he died aboard one of the ships. His cause of death remains debated, perhaps the slow hand of lead poisoning, perhaps pneumonia, perhaps simply age combined with the unforgiving elements. His passing was a blow to morale, leaving the men rudderless in more ways than one. Command passed to Francis Crozier, captain of the Terror, who would attempt to save what remained of the mission. By 1848, with the ships still imprisoned in ice and supplies dwindling, Crozier made the desperate decision to abandon both vessels. One of the few documents recovered from the expedition is a single page, now known as the Victory Point Note, which recorded Franklin's death and the decision to march south toward the Canadian mainland. 105 men left there. Trapped ships, dragging sledges laden with supplies across the barren ice. They hoped to reach safety, to find open water, or possibly encounter Inuit communities who might help them. Instead, they walked into the jaws of the Arctic wilderness, where exhaustion, starvation, and sickness stalked their every step. Inuit oral traditions, passed down for generations, tell of starving white men seen stumbling along the ice, gaunt and desperate. Some accounts describe groups trying to boil boots and leather straps to soften them enough to eat. Others speak of grisly acts of cannibalism, men reduced to consuming the flesh of their companions in a final attempt to survive. When search expeditions later recovered bones, some bore unmistakable cut marks, consistent with these oral histories. Though Victorian society recoiled in horror at the suggestion, the evidence left little room for denial. The Arctic had reduced Britain's finest to acts too terrible to contemplate. Yet even in those final days, the mystery deepened. Why did so many die so quickly? Why abandon ships that, though trapped, still offered some shelter? Why was no coherent plan carried out to preserve even a handful of lives? Modern science points again to the poisoning from canned food, compounded by scurvy, hypothermia, and sheer exhaustion. But the precise details, the choices, the breakdowns in discipline, the final moments of each man remain hidden beneath layers of ice and time. What is certain is that by the time later searchers arrived, none remained alive. Campsites were found, littered with abandoned supplies, books, and personal items, but no survivors. The ships themselves seemed to vanish as if swallowed whole by the Arctic seas. For years, the fate of Franklin and his men was little more than whispers and half-truths, a puzzle that haunted Britain and baffled the very scientists who believed they could explain everything. The silence after that last sighting in 1845 became one of the most chilling mysteries of the 19th century. An expedition that began with such confidence, so well equipped and seemingly invincible, had vanished completely. No letters returned, no triumphant reports of victory, only silence broken by fragments that raised more questions than answers. Science, with all its rational tools, could not solve what the ice had claimed, and in that silence, the 1845 mystery grew larger than the men themselves, becoming not just the story of ships and sailors, but a reminder that there are places in this world where human knowledge still falters, and where the earth keeps its secrets locked away. The silence surrounding the Franklin expedition soon became unbearable. By the late 1840s, families of the missing men grew frantic, and the Admiralty, once so confident, could no longer ignore the void. At first, officials reassured the public that Franklin was safe, wintering in the ice as planned. After all, Arctic expeditions often required years before returning. But as the seasons passed and no letters arrived, no messenger ship sailed, back, unease hardened into fear. The proud mission that had sailed off with such fanfare was now shrouded in mystery, and Britain could not tolerate the possibility that its finest ships and sailors had simply vanished without explanation. Thus began one of the most determined search efforts in maritime history, a sprawling campaign that would stretch across decades, consuming fortunes, lives, and reputations, while delivering only fragments of an answer. Asterisk in 1848, the Admiralty officially launched its first rescue missions. They were not small undertakings. Ships were dispatched by sea, cutting into the northern ice in hopes of intercepting Franklin's route. Others attempted to march overland across the Canadian Arctic, following rivers and frozen channels that might have carried the lost men. Each new expedition faced the same obstacles that had doomed Franklin's shifting ice, deadly temperatures, and a wilderness that showed no mercy. Instead of bringing back survivors, these search parties often returned battered, lucky to have survived themselves. Yet piece by piece, they began to uncover a trail of shadows. Asterisk, the earliest discoveries were pitiful in their vagueness. A few cairns, deliberately stacked stone markers, stood as silent signals in the icy void, but they contained no clear messages. Some campsites were found, littered with abandoned gear boots, clothing, even silver cutlery engraved with officers. Names, but no men. These objects seemed to mock the searchers. Proof that Franklin's crew had been there, alive and struggling, and yet no clue of what had ultimately become of them. Asterisk, as the years dragged on, the British public grew restless. Newspapers fueled the frenzy, publishing every rumor, every whisper from the north. Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John's devoted wife, became the most relentless advocate for continued searches. She lobbied officials, raised private funds, and pushed explorers to keep going, long after the Admiralty's enthusiasm had cooled. For her, the Arctic was not a distant wasteland, it was a grave that had swallowed her husband, and she would not rest until the truth was pried from its frozen silence. Asterisk search missions multiplied, and with them came strange new accounts. Inuit communities encountered along the coasts began to share oral histories. They told of meeting starving white men dragging heavy sledges, of abandoned ships trapped in the ice, and of corpses scattered across the snow. These stories were passed through interpreters and often dismissed by Europeans at the time, who struggled to believe or trust indigenous testimony. Yet decades later, these accounts would prove to be among the most accurate recollections of what really happened. Asterisk, some expeditions brought back physical remains. Human bones, weathered and broken, were recovered from the icy wilderness. To the horror of many, cut marks were found etched into some of them, suggesting that the desperate men had turned to cannibalism. For Victorian society, which clung tightly to ideals of honor and discipline, the suggestion was nearly unthinkable. Many dismissed it outright, insisting the British sailor would sooner die than commit such an act. But the evidence, grim and undeniable, whispered otherwise. Asterisk, the search itself became a saga, almost as legendary as the tragedy it sought to explain. Dozens of ships scoured the Arctic archipelago, some never returning themselves, victims of the same ice that had claimed Franklin. The American explorer Elisha Kent Kane nearly lost his crew to starvation. Others, like Leopold McClintock, managed to recover further evidence, scattered documents, skeletal remains, and most importantly, the infamous Victory Point note, single official record left behind by Franklin's men, confirming Franklin's death and their doomed attempt to march south. Yet even this document raised more questions than it answered. Why abandon well-equipped ships in favor of an almost suicidal overland march? Why had so many perished so quickly? Asterisk, for the public, each discovery seemed to deepen, rather than resolve, the mystery. Instead of closure, the scattered bones, half-burned campsites, and tantalizing scraps of paper created a narrative of suffering without explanation. The expedition's fate became an obsession not just for Britain, but for the world. Franklin's disappearance inspired novels, paintings, and endless speculation. It was no longer merely a lost voyage. It had become a myth of endurance and horror, a story that blurred the lines between science, superstition, and human fragility. Lady Franklin's determination ensured the searches continued far longer than the Admiralty ever intended. She spent her fortune sponsoring voyages, refusing to let her husband's legacy slip into obscurity. To many, she became a symbol of devotion, as unyielding as the ice itself. Yet, despite all the effort, by the close of the 19th century, no complete answer had been found. The ships were gone, the men dead, and the truth remained locked beneath the Arctic seas. The failure of the search missions mirrored the failure of the expedition itself. Both were swallowed by the same wilderness that defied human understanding. What science had promised, the ability to map, explain, and control the natural world, seemed hollow when faced with the white silence of the North. Each mission carried instruments, charts, and theories, yet all returned humbled, bearing little more than relics of tragedy. The Arctic, vast and indifferent, gave up only fragments, as though mocking the confidence of those who believed it could be conquered. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Franklin expedition had become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the age. Families had long since mourned, searchers had ceased their journeys, and yet the questions endured. What had truly happened on those last marshes across the ice? How had such a well-prepared force unraveled into starvation, madness, and death? And why had science, with all its proud advances, failed to explain the mystery of 1845? The fragments remained, but the full story was still lost, frozen away with the bones of the men who had walked into the endless white. As the searchers pressed deeper into the Arctic over the years, the fragments they uncovered began to weave together a picture not of heroism and triumph, but of a slow descent into horror. What the Admiralty had once hoped would be remembered as Britain's crowning achievement of exploration instead revealed itself as a tragedy steeped in fear, desperation, and human suffering. For every spoon or button brought back from the ice, there were darker clues, hints of starvation, madness, and acts so grim that Victorian society recoiled from them. The Franklin expedition had set out as the pride of an empire, but what it left behind was a tale that haunted the imagination of all who heard it. The first signs of that creeping horror came not from official reports, but from Inuit testimony. The Inuit, who had lived in the Arctic for centuries and understood its cruel rhythms, told of encountering groups of white men wandering the ice, emaciated and desperate. They described sledges so heavy they seemed impossible to pull, laden not with food, but with bizarre cargo silver cutlery, books, and even officers' uniforms, useless in the battle against starvation. Some accounts mention men who appeared too weak to walk, collapsing where they stood, their companions trudging on in silence. These stories were dismissed at first, filtered through layers of translation and prejudice, but when search expeditions later stumbled upon campsites matching these descriptions, it became harder to deny that the Inuit had been speaking the truth. At those campsites, the evidence spoke in whispers more chilling than words. Human remains were scattered among the snow and stones, skeletons lying face down in the direction of the south, as if they had fallen mid-stride in their desperate attempt to reach safety. Some were found still clad in fragments of uniform, the stiff collars and brass buttons, a grim reminder of the discipline they had once tried to uphold. Around them lay personal effects, a pocket watch, a Bible, a pair of boots, frozen relics of ordinary lives brought to extraordinary ruin. But it was the marks on the bones that chilled the blood of those who examined them. Cut marks, deliberate and unmistakable, scored into the surfaces of rib cages and femurs. To any experienced eye, they told a story of bodies butchered, flesh stripped from bone. The conclusion was horrifying. In their final days, Franklin's men had turned on one another for food. For Victorian Britain, the idea was unbearable. A naval officer was held up as a model of discipline, honor, and Christian virtue. To imagine those men trained, loyal, and proud reduced to cannibalism struck at the very heart of the empire's identity. When reports of these findings reached London, they were met with outrage. Critics accused searchers of slander, insisting the Inuit testimony and the marks on the bones had been misinterpreted. Officially, the Admiralty preferred silence, as though refusing to acknowledge the possibility could erase it from history. Yet the whispers would not vanish, and each new discovery seemed to strengthen the dreadful truth. The horror was not confined to cannibalism alone. Modern science has revealed that many of the men likely suffered from lead poisoning, the slow poison leaching from the poorly sealed canned food they had depended upon. The symptoms, confusion, irritability, trembling hands would have clouded judgment, making survival decisions erratic and desperate. Coupled with scurvy, which ravaged their bodies, and the unrelenting cold that gnawed at them day and night, their minds and wills must have frayed. The journals and letters that might have recorded their decline were lost to the ice, but the silent evidence remains. Abandoned sledges, loaded with unnecessary trinkets, piles of discarded supplies that suggest men no longer thought clearly. Wandering further into chaos, searchers also found traces of attempts to adapt, as though the men clung to order even in the face of doom. Small stone shelters were discovered, rough and unfinished, built on barren stretches of coast where no shelter could truly protect them. Cooking pots lay abandoned, blackened from fires that had burned long ago, perhaps fueled with the last scraps of wood torn from sledges or even from the ships themselves. In one site, a skeleton was found laid out with care, as though buried with the last dignity his companions could muster before they too succumbed. These gestures hinted at the humanity that flickered even as survival instincts drove them toward unthinkable acts. What made the horror so powerful, so enduring in the imagination, was not just what happened, but the contrast with what was expected. The Franklin expedition had been a showcase of science and progress, the embodiment of Britain's belief that no frontier was unconquerable. The ships had been reinforced with iron, fitted with steam engines, stocked with years of supplies. The officers were educated, the sailors experienced. To see such preparation unravel into starvation, madness, and cannibalism was more than a tragedy. It was a humiliation for Victorian science, a brutal reminder that nature remained untamed and indifferent to human ambition. And yet, even as the horror came into focus, the full picture remained elusive. Why did they abandon the ship so early? Why carry silver spoons across barren ice when food was scarce? Why did they not attempt to live as the Inuit did, adapting to the land with hunting and knowledge? These questions only deepened the sense of dread, for they hinted at minds clouded not only by suffering, but by a failure to see beyond the confines of their own culture. Trapped in their own discipline, their own vision of order, they were unable to surrender to the lessons of the land. The creeping horror was not only in their deaths, but in the realization that their training and technology, once thought invincible, had betrayed them. By the time searchers pieced together these grim details, the Franklin expedition had already slipped into legend. It became less a story of discovery and more a cautionary tale of human vulnerability, of the razor-thin line between civilization and savagery. The horror was not in the Arctic itself. It was in the men who, faced with an unyielding world, revealed the most fragile and desperate parts of the human spirit. In the silence that followed, the unanswered questions that still linger ensured that the creeping horror of 1845 would remain a mystery that science alone could never fully explain. The discoveries from the search missions and the whispers of horror that followed should have provided clarity, but instead, they led only to further questions that science, in all its Victorian confidence, could not answer. The Franklin expedition had been conceived as a triumph of technology and preparation, the shining proof that Britain's knowledge could tame even the harshest wilderness. Yet the very tools of that knowledge seemed to fail, and each explanation proposed by investigators left gaps wide enough for the imagination to fill with darker possibilities. By the mid-19th century, when rationalism and the scientific method were celebrated as the engines of progress, the mystery of 1845 stood as a bitter reminder that there were still places where reason faltered. From the beginning, the official narrative clashed with reality. The Admiralty had sent Franklin north with every advantage: steam engines to cut through ice, reinforced hulls, 3 years of provisions, and the latest instruments of navigation. If success was possible for anyone, surely it was for this expedition. When the men began dying so quickly, science strained to explain why. The first theory was simple: starvation. But starvation alone could not account for the speed of their decline, nor the madness implied by the abandonment of supplies and the senseless hauling of luxury goods across desolate ice. Something more insidious had to be at work. By the late 19th century, scientists began examining the preserved remains of crew members recovered from the Arctic permafrost. In one haunting case, the bodies of 3 young sailors were found on Beechy Island, buried in permafrost that had kept their faces almost eerily intact, as if they had died only yesterday. Autopsies revealed alarming levels of lead in their tissues, far higher than normal. It seemed that the very canned food designed to keep the men alive had poisoned them instead. The tinning process, still relatively new, had relied on lead solder to seal the cans. Over months and years, lead leached into the contents. The sailors consumed it daily, slowly accumulating the metal in their bodies until confusion, weakness, and mental decline took hold. Lead poisoning offered answers, but not a full explanation. Some historians argued that the levels detected were not enough to account for the entire disaster. Others suggested the poisoning was severe, impairing judgment so badly that the men made irrational choices, abandoning their ships too early, hauling useless items, failing to ration food properly. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Yet even as science pointed to lead, it could not explain every fragment of the story. Why, for instance, had the officers not recognized the symptoms? Why did no one leave a fuller record, even a simple diary of their decline? It was as though madness and despair had erased not only their lives, but their voices as well. Other explanations joined the debate. Scurvy was almost certainly a factor. Without fresh meat or citrus, the men's bodies would have weakened, their gums bleeding, their wounds refusing to heal. Starvation and exposure played their parts. 2. As hunting failed and the cold stripped them of strength. Some scientists even suggested that botulism, caused by contaminated canned food, may have poisoned the expedition. In modern times, analyses of bone collagen and hair samples from recovered remains continue to be studied, revealing layers of malnutrition, disease, and toxic exposure. But none of these findings create a complete picture. Instead, they reveal a tangle of causes, each contributing to a slow collapse that science has never fully untangled. The problem was not only the physical causes of death, but the choices the men made. Why march south with sledges, weighed down by silverware, instead of food? Why abandon relatively safe ships to plunge into a wasteland on foot? Why carry books, uniforms, and even a piano on sledges across endless ice? To scientists and historians, these decisions seemed irrational, almost suicidal. Lead poisoning and scurvy might explain part of it, but the evidence also pointed to something deeper: the limits of Victorian thinking. The expedition had been trained and equipped under the rigid discipline of the Royal Navy, a culture that valued hierarchy, honor, and adherence to rules above improvisation. To adopt Inuit methods of survival hunting seals, building igloos, Wearing furs may have seemed unthinkable to men bound by a code that saw such practices as primitive. And so, science could explain the poisons in their blood and the disease in their bones, but not the cultural blindness that sealed their fate. Even more unsettling was the lack of closure. For decades, no one knew where the ships had gone. Searchers combed islands and coastlines, but the Erebus and Terror themselves seemed to have vanished. Only in the 21st century were the wrecks finally discovered, preserved beneath the Arctic waters. Their locations raised new questions still. How had they drifted so far from where they were abandoned? Did some of the crew return to the ships after leaving them? Were their survivors longer than historians believed? Each answer unearthed by science seemed to open another door to uncertainty. The Franklin mystery revealed a paradox at the heart of Victorian ambition. Science had been meant to bring clarity, to impose order on the unknown. But in the Arctic, each attempt at explanation led to ambiguity. Each discovery exposed the limits of understanding. To admit that lead, scurvy, starvation, and human frailty had undone the expedition was to admit that no amount of preparation could guarantee mastery over nature. For an empire that prided itself on progress, that was a hard truth to face. And so, the mystery remained suspended between fact and speculation, science and folklore. Inuit oral histories, once dismissed, were later confirmed as strikingly accurate. Yet even they could not reveal every detail of the men's last moments. The silence of the dead, the gaps in the record, the strange behavior of the crew, these remained beyond the reach of instruments or autopsies. Science could illuminate pieces of the puzzle, but the full picture lay just beyond its grasp, swallowed by the ice. The 1845 expedition was meant to prove that knowledge could conquer all. Instead, it showed the fragility of that belief. The failure was not only of ships and men, but of the very confidence that science could explain every mystery. And in that failure, the story took on its haunting power, lingering long after the ice had buried the evidence. The decades that followed the disappearance of Franklin's expedition transformed it from a maritime tragedy into something much larger, a legend, a cautionary tale, and an enduring mystery that cast its shadow across generations. The Erebus and Terror had set sail in 1845 as the pinnacles of British technology and confidence. Yet by the close of the 19th century, they had become symbols of hubris and loss. Their fate left scars, not only on the families of the 129 men who never returned, but also on the very fabric of the empire that had sent them north with such pride. The legacy of the mystery was not measured solely in the fragments of bone and metal retrieved from the ice, but in the way the world remembered them, through story, speculation, and the uneasy realization that progress had limits. Lady Jane Franklin was central to that legacy. For decades after her husband vanished, she refused to accept silence as an answer. She pressured Parliament, lobbied the Admiralty, and even financed her own search missions. Her persistence ensured that Franklin's name never faded from public consciousness. Without her relentless campaign, it is likely the mystery would have drifted into obscurity, overshadowed by newer adventures. Instead, she turned it into a national obsession, a moral cause, a story that demanded closure. She was determined that her husband would not be remembered as a failed explorer, but as a martyr to the pursuit of knowledge. Her efforts succeeded. In 1854, when Inuit testimony suggested that Franklin's men had starved and perhaps resorted to cannibalism, she denounced the claims and fought to preserve his image as a hero. In time, Britain adopted her version of the tale. Monuments were raised in his honor, and schoolchildren learned not of failure, but of noble sacrifice. The very absence of definitive answers allowed Franklin's memory to be shaped into whatever narrative was most convenient for the empire. But beyond Britain's shores, the legacy was less tidy. To the Inuit, the story of Franklin's men became another thread in their long oral tradition of encounters with outsiders who entered the Arctic without understanding it. Their testimonies, dismissed by Victorians, were later vindicated by archaeology and forensics. In their stories, Franklin's men were remembered not as noble martyrs, but as desperate strangers, dragging sledges heavy with useless items, ignoring the skills that might have saved them. This divergence of memory heroism in the Empire. Desperation in the North underscored the cultural blindness at the heart of the expedition. The Inuit lived in balance with the ice. The British sought to conquer it and were destroyed. That contrast became one of the most enduring lessons of the tragedy. The Franklin mystery also left its mark on the history of science itself. In the Victorian age, failure was not easily admitted, yet the expedition forced scientists to confront the limits of their knowledge. Forensic studies of bones and preserved remains became some of the earliest examples of modern pathology applied to history. Autopsies on the frozen bodies at Beechey Island offered glimpses into scurvy and lead poisoning, sparking debates about nutrition, industrial food preservation, and the dangers of toxins. Even in its horror, the expedition advanced science, but in ways unintended, serving as a grim case study of how human systems collapse in extreme environments. Literature and art seized on the story as well. The silence of the Arctic, the hints of cannibalism, the bravery turned to futility. These themes inspired writers and painters across Europe and America. Ballads were sung about Franklin's noble voyage. Novels borrowed from the imagery of ghost ships lost in the ice. Paintings depicted the frozen wilderness, dotted with the skeletal remains of explorers, as though the Arctic itself were a graveyard for human pride. The mystery became myth, and myth became legacy. Even as the 19th century ended, the obsession did not fade. New expeditions, long after any hope of survivors had vanished, continued to search, not to rescue, but to answer the riddle. Each fragment brought home was treated as a relic, placed in museums, studied, and debated. The Franklin expedition had become a mirror in which society saw its anxieties reflected about the costs of empire, the dangers of progress, and the terrifying possibility that nature could not be subdued. In the 20th century, the story gained a new afterlife. Archaeologists uncovered more bones, more campsites, confirming at last what the Victorians had denied, that starvation and cannibalism had indeed taken place. Scientists tested remains for lead and other toxins, deepening the portrait of disaster. And still, the mystery endured. The ships themselves remained hidden, their final resting places unknown. It was as if the ice had swallowed them whole to preserve the riddle. Not until 2014 was HMS Erebus discovered, lying quietly beneath the Canadian waters. And in 2016, HMS Terror followed. The wrecks were astonishingly well preserved, cabins intact, artifacts still resting on shelves. Yet even these discoveries left questions unanswered. Why had the ships been abandoned, then later recrewed? How had they drifted so far from their last known position? What final choices had the men made in those silent months? At Franklin, mystery endures because it is incomplete. Science can offer fragments, probabilities, and evidence, but never certainty. The bones tell of cannibalism, but not of the thoughts in men's minds when they crossed the terrible threshold. The lead levels speak of poisoning, but not of the exact moment reason gave way to madness. The ships lie preserved, but the logbooks that might have explained everything are gone. What remains is a story shaped by both fact and imagination, a puzzle forever missing its last piece. The legacy of 1845, then, is not only the loss of 129 men, but the unsettling truth that some questions resist final answers. The Arctic held its silence for over a century and a half, and even now, when sonar and forensic science can peer into places once thought unreachable, the story still eludes complete explanation. For the empire that once believed science could conquer all, that is the most haunting legacy of all that, in the heart of the white wilderness, mystery prevailed. If this tale of silence, starvation, and mystery gripped you, remember the ice still keeps its secrets, and so do we. Subscribe to Bloodlore for more stories history tried to bury, but legend refuses to forget.